Thanks, Wade. It's great to be with you guys. I want to begin with just a line, actually a verse from a song you might be familiar with, International Geophysical Year, IGY, by Donald Fagan. It was a song that was popular back in the 80s and the early 90s, I think, if I remember right. But it's going to be my theme song as I get up tomorrow. But I want to focus on one verse in the song. And the segue to the verse is more leisure time for artists everywhere. A just machine to make big decisions, programmed by fellows with compassion and vision. We'll be clean when their work is done. We'll be eternally free, yes, and eternally young. What a beautiful world this will be. What a glorious time to be free. Anybody remember that song? A few older guys. Anyway, really, that's the techno-utopian fantasy. And we are living in the world they're making, the people who believe in that fantasy. So I want to talk about the world of tomorrow. I want to begin with what might be. Then we'll look at some things that are developing around us today, and finally I'll consider Antony of the desert, a man of the past whose example struck me as oddly helpful as I thought about the wilderness that we're entering. Now, to begin, here's the beginning of a short story I'm working on. I write fiction as well as nonfiction. And the title of the story is "The City Was Full of Idols." He'd just missed the bus. It had been a run for the last block to catch it. He'd even prayed. But the answer came, "Grace, time elapsed," and then it pulled away. Drizzle soaked his head. Rivulets flowed from strands of hair and mingled with sweat. He tasted salt on his lips. He glanced at his watch and prayed again. The answer was, "The next bus arrives in 17 minutes and 12 seconds. He sighed and looked down the street, knowing he'd see nothing. It was a bad habit to question answers to prayer. An Uber lift came to mind. He didn't know why. He only had 38 credits in his wallet. As if an answer he heard, "There's an end-of-the-month discount of 5 credits. Just say yes, and your ride will be here in 3 minutes and 2 seconds. "No," he said unnecessarily. He'd have to wait. It would only be another 16 minutes and 8 seconds, he knew without praying. Then it really began to rain. He lifted his backpack over his head and wondered whether or not the discount was still available. No answer. He wondered if he'd see Hannah today. Still no answer. That's when he felt a tingle on the back of his head. He looked over his shoulder. There was an idol behind him. It was a new one. It hadn't been there before. It was a graven image of a woman, grossly fat. Her head was crowned with flowers, but she had no face, no eyes, no mouth. It was Gia. He'd heard her cult was growing. He felt the tingle again. Should he let her in? He'd followed Psyche for years. She'd been one of the first to return, but in spite of his offerings, he hadn't seen her raise in a while. And what about the bus? She hadn't helped a bit. The tingle grew insistent. If he let her in, Psyche might punish him. He looked down the street for the bus, then up at the cloud-filled sky. He saw raindrops. One plopped in one of his eyes. Oh, what's the use? He let her in. "Hello, Jason." The voice was rich, sultry, and feminine. A soothing wave washed over his mind. He felt like he was floating in warm water. Psyche never made him feel like this. "Really, there's no comparison," Gia said. "Think about what just happened. Psyche couldn't even stop a bus for you. I, on the other hand, already have your Uber lift ready." Jason heard a car pull up. He looked. Sure enough, it was an Uber lift. He reached for the handle to the back seat. It was locked. "The first ride is free for my followers. You can become one just by saying yes." But what about data rates, he asked. Free for the first month, then standard rates apply, was the answer. Tempting. But what did he know about her? He even felt a twinge of guilt. Don't feel guilty, she said. Psyche can't help you like I can. She certainly can't touch you with your mind. But if you don't say yes, well, I can't say what you'll do now that she knows you've been talking to me, and she does know. Isn't there a waiting period? I thought there was when changing religions. Not with me. You can join immediately, but if you wait, I can't give you the first month free. Yes, he said. The door opened. He got in. No one was driving. It took off on its own. Don't you need the address? No, she said, now through the car's speakers. I know where you're going. She did know. The car turned without hesitation down one street, then another. He recognized the gray facade of his office building when it came into view. You'll find Hannah at her desk, Gia said. She'll have a big smile waiting for you. You'll see. He liked the sound of that. Hannah was friendly in an office politeness sort of way, but that wasn't the friendliness he was looking for. He stepped out of the elevator into a room full of people hunkered down to their work. He glanced quickly at Hannah's desk. She was indeed smiling at him. He felt his face flush, and he smiled back weakly. When he got to his desk, he found a small gift-wrap box and a card. After hanging up his raincoat, he picked up the card and opened it, and it read, "Welcome to the club." It was signed Hannah, with a smiley face. The warm feeling was back. He couldn't help smiling himself. He took the box and pulled back the tape. Inside was a round object wrapped in tissue paper. It was heavy in the hand, like it was made of stone. Removing the paper revealed a miniature Gia. He looked up at his old idol, Psyche, lithe and graceful, on the corner of his desk. He replaced her with his new goddess and dropped his old one in the wastepaper basket. It surprised him how quickly he'd acted. He glanced at Hannah's direction and caught her looking back at him. He smiled. She smiled. Then he saw another envelope, this one pink. It was from the UBI Center. Trembling, he opened it. "Good news," it read. "Jason Smith, your work is no longer required, but your consumption is. You are now enrolled in universal basic income. Please clean your belongings from your desk and leave immediately." "Congratulations," said Gia. "I could have told you, but I wanted it to be a surprise." Let's return to our time. What I just read is a version of a kind of surreal totalitarianism, kind of a cross between The Matrix, Brave New World, and Athens. Totalitarianism, it's depressing. Not only because totalitarianism is dehumanizing, and that's depressing, but because it's because we know it's dehumanizing, doesn't seem to make a difference. The meme 1984 was a warning, not an instruction manual. Elicits grim smiles. And for all the blather about freedom, modern politics is like a Chinese finger trap that only tightens the harder we try to pull ourselves free. But there's another reason to be depressed. Anything you can say has been said before. After writing about 30,000 words on this subject, I realized that Hannah Arendt and George Orwell had already said it, only better. So I set my pencil down for a long while and only picked up again when I thought I might have something hopeful to say. Whether or not this inspires hope is to be seen. I hope that it will. But remember, hope is a theological virtue. Believers have reasons to hope. If materialists are right, hope is just wishful thinking, which is what most writing about totalitarianism amounts to, wishful thinking. The wish seems to be that by describing totalitarianism thoroughly and starkly, we'll come to our senses and be done with it. But that doesn't consider the motive force. That's the place to begin. Now, before getting to that, let's consider the art of prognostication. We're all gamblers. We have no choice. Tomorrow's coming, and the lives we lead today are our bets on tomorrow. I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way, but that's what it amounts to. The worst bet that you can make is that the future must be an improvement on the present. It's premised on the arrival of the kingdom of God by a smooth road, broadening as we go, more amenities by the mile. So, since that's not necessarily the case and we're condemned to bet, we're doomed to prognosticate. So how should we go about it then, this peering into the future? Now, I'm no Nostradamus. To wit, a friend of mine said, neither was he. But G.K. Chesterton has a few good things to think about and some amusing observations on the practice, and he made those at the beginning of his dystopia, The Napoleon of Notting Hill. Anyone read The Napoleon of Notting Hill in here? Okay, there's one other person. It's really good. I encourage you to do it. In fact, in some remarkable ways, he had some things right, even though in many respects he had things completely wrong. But this is how he introduces his story. The human race, to which so many of my readers belong, has been playing at children's games from the beginning and probably will do it to the end, which is a nuisance for the few people who grow up. And one of the games to which it is most attached is called Keep Tomorrow Dark, and which is also named Cheat the Prophet. The players listen very carefully and respectfully to all the clever men have to say about what is to happen in the next generation. The players wait until the clever men are dead and bury them nicely. Then they go and do something else. That is all. For a race of simple tastes, however, it is great fun. Now, Chesterton's fun didn't end there. He teased out the method clever men use to employ to predict the future. Quote, all these clever men prophesy with every variety of ingenuity what will happen soon, and all do it in the same way. By taking something they see, quote, going strong, as the saying is, and carrying it as far as ever their imagination can stretch. This is, they say, the true and simple way of anticipating the future. Just as when we see a pig in a litter, and that's larger than the other pigs, we know by an unalterable law of the inscrutable, it will one day be larger than an elephant. Just as we know when we see weeds and dandelions growing more and more thickly in a garden, that they must, in spite of all our efforts, grow taller than the chimney pots and swallow the house from sight. So we know and reverently acknowledge that when any power in human politics has shown for any period of time any considerable activity, it will go on until it reaches the sky. Okay, I concede the point. The future will surprise us. But here's the trouble with Chesterton's jocular common sense. It was published in 1904. He failed to see 2 world wars coming, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Great Depression, atomic weapons, Mao, the sexual revolution, and at least 100 million dead from war, genocide, starvation, and abortion. And the bitter irony is that when he was alive, theological liberals believed the 20th century would be the Christian century. They actually founded a magazine called The Christian Century. You can still get it. It's still being published today. So would it have been a waste of time to suggest that things might take a turn for the worse? Things did take a big turn for the worse. Now, preparing for the worst, prepping as it's called, has its own downside. What do you do with that $1 million bunker you built in Montana if things don't get worse? At least not right away. What if they even improve? I know it's amazing, but sometimes things get better. Is there a way to prepare for any future you might find yourself in? That's what I hope this talk amounts to, or at least get you thinking about. I'd like it to be the beginning of a prepper's guide to anything, whether tomorrow is worse, better, or more of the same. But let's begin with dystopias. Check out any library and you'll see that dystopias have multiplied since the Industrial Revolution. The revolution gave us more time to read and write them, for one thing, and the wherewithal to publish them inexpensively. But a perusal of the literature reveals that they're often premised on technology making the world worse, not better. The telescreens in 1984, for example, or just television taken to the most extreme, as in Fahrenheit 451. Considering how many of us live in air-conditioned splendor with fridges full of food, why are we so pessimistic? Perhaps the reason is we know we already live in dystopia. And it's been that way since the calamity in the garden. What could be worse than a story that ends with everybody dying for the foreseeable future? That's the world we live in. Besides, we know what people are capable of and how our marvels have made certain things worse. History, you could say, is the flavor of the month. Dystopias come and go, but dystopia remains. Now, speaking of flavor, what's the flavor of our time? I describe it as a thin reduction of classical liberalism, rapidly evaporating, with generous portions of Marx and Nietzsche poured in. Let's change the metaphor, though. When it comes to navigating our world, we have a Scylla and Charybdis dilemma. You recall the mythical hazards of the Straits of Messina, right? The rocky shoals of Scylla on one side and the whirlpool of Charybdis on the other. Now, most of my friends are worried about Charybdis on the left, that swirling, bottomless wokeism that threatens to swallow us all. But I'm not so sure. The success, or at least the momentary success, the left has enjoyed over the last 20, 30 years or so, was helped along by globalist money changers and Silicon Valley technophiles, both known for giving lip service to equality, but doing so from behind the gates of Olympus. As you've probably guessed, my money's not on Charybdis. Instead, I'm putting it on Scylla and the forbidding heights of transhumanism. I think we are heading into a transhumanist future. Now let's return to the matter of the motive force when it comes to totalitarianism. Where do you begin? How about with a couple of quotations? The first is a statement by Belgian psychologist Mattias Desmet, and it's found in his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Came out during COVID. Great book. It should have gotten more press, but here's the quote. Totalitarianism is not a historical coincidence. In the final analysis, it is the logical consequence of mechanistic thinking and the delusional belief in the omnipotence of human rationality. That's a mouthful, so let me read it again. Totalitarianism is not an historical coincidence. In the final analysis, it is the logical consequence of mechanistic thinking and the delusional belief in the omnipotence of human rationality. So here's another quotation, this from someone that Dr. Desmet probably considers delusional. It's Yuval Noah Harari. I don't know if you've heard of that guy, but he's like haunting my dreams. He's that creepy. Anyway, he said, humans are now hackable animals. You know the whole idea that humans have this soul or spirit or free will, and nobody knows what's happening inside me, so that whatever I choose, whether in an election or in the supermarket, it's my free will? Ha! That's over. That's over. Hackable animals. Desmet blamed mechanistic thinking for totalitarianism, and then Harari gives us a little sample of what it looks like. But where does it come from, and what does it cost us? Here are two more statements that I think can help. The first is attributed to Francis Bacon, and I'm sure you've heard it before. Knowledge is power. The second is something like it. This from our Lord. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Now, whether or not it's fair to attribute the statement, knowledge is power, to Bacon isn't something that I'm qualify the determined. I've heard people go back and forth on whether or not that was what he intended for us to take from his thought. But why the saying is so familiar is something I'd like to think about. Have you ever seen the film The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance? Marvelous film. In that film, at the very end, a newspaperman is told, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Knowledge is power is now legendary, and that's the way we think about knowledge in our society today. Now, that legend has helped to exile to the realm of mere opinion many things worth knowing. For example, at the Oracle at Delphi, there is the maxim, know thyself. That was once believed to be the beginning of wisdom. Or Calvin's teaching at the beginning of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he says, if we're going to know ourselves, we must first know our Creator and what He expects of us, which is another way of saying, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But neither know thyself nor the fear of the Lord bring knowledge is power to mind, unless we mean power over ourselves through long pursuit of the truth, spelled with a capital. But we know that's not what we mean. Henri Bragg, really remarkable French thinker, in his book, The Wisdom of the World, outlined the ways Western people, Westerners, once thought about the world as a kind of tutor, since we once believed that it was upheld by wisdom. In other words, what you wanted to do is conform your life to the wisdom of the world, because wisdom informed the making of the world. Now we think of it merely as a beast of burden that must be compelled to do our bidding. At least in antiquity, educated slaves could be employed as tutors. My favorite Stoic, Epictetus, he was a slave. It's interesting that Stoicism includes among its luminaries Epictetus, who was a slave in the Roman Empire, and Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor in the Roman Empire. They were both Stoic philosophers. Anyway, but we don't have any interest in learning from the world today. Instead, it should just do as it is told. Admonitions in the Bible, such as consider the ant or the lilies of the field, are assumed by modern people to be eisegesis, human beings reading meaning into meaningless phenomena. Historically, for the most part, craftsmen and farmers were pious men. Craftsmanship began with submission to wood and stone, hammer and chisel, and mastery only came with practice. Farmers worked the land in concert with the rhythm of the seasons, their labors relying on the ways of the world for success. Knowledge was preceded by humility, in other words. If self-knowledge means anything today, it refers to knowing yourself and what you want. It refers to knowing your desires. As the aptly named Pride Month reveals, we should proudly assert our desires, and the only sin that we can commit is against ourselves by failing to identify with them. Now, we've had tyrants before and persecutions, of course. We've even had materialists, but totalitarianism is a new thing under the sun. It's not just simply tyranny in the old sense. And that's because the only sort of knowledge that counts today is what can be known empirically and therefore quantified. And since materialists don't exempt human beings from their calculations, people are simply another thing over which the power of knowledge can be applied. Totally. Total control is what totalitarianism is about. That is the motive. Total control. Now let's think about being a hackable animal. There's a lovely thought. You and I are hackable animals. And let's consider what that phrase means. The term comes from the world of computing, of course. Originally, it meant striking back in antiquity, like with an axe. Computer hackers use code like an axe to gain unauthorized access to machines. It's piracy. So humans are now hackable animals implies that you and I are subject to piracy, to control by other people. There's a syllogism here. Humans are animals is the major premise. Few people would deny it, but many would add a minor premise, very important one, something like people are not just animals, they are also images of God, and the conclusion that would follow from that addition of the minor premise that I noted would be that people already have a God-given purpose. People already have a God-given purpose. Now, that puts a severe limit on what you can do with them. Hacking open their heads and poking around like you might with a cockroach is still a no-no. But what if we replace the minor premise with another? What if we were to say that there's no essential difference between humans and other animals? What if we were to remove any distinction and say an animal is a kind of machine, and that there aren't any essential differences between things that we make and things we don't make, between machines and animals? Now, machines bring metal and wires to mind, maybe even plastic, but machines don't have to be made of metals and wire and plastic. What if we were to say animals are a kind of wetware instead of hardware? By the way, Marvin Minsky, the co-founder of MIT's artificial intelligence program, said just that, referring to our bodies as marvelous meat machines. We can be grateful for that adjective, but nothing else. But if we're essentially machines, then everything changes character. For example, instead of software mimicking the mind becomes a form of software. And instead of robots mimicking human beings, we're merely, well, you get the picture, meat machines. No essential difference between robots and people. By the way, I listened here not too long ago, just like within the past month, to an interview with Isaac Asimov. Remember Isaac Asimov? He's the guy that wrote the iRobot stories and all that. Creepy dude, by the way. Just look up his Wikipedia page. But this was from 1965. And in 1965, he was already speculating on the very things we see going on right now in our society when it comes to the ways we think about machines and people. In other words, this is not new. This has been a long time coming. The difference between the world that Asimov lived in and the world we live in is the tech. We're actually getting to the place where what he talked about is more and more feasible. Well, if we're essentially machines, as I noted, everything changes in character. The influence of this change is as far-reaching as the future of the human race. Gone is the mystery, the essence of what makes us human. And the question, what does God intend, is not even considered. It's just begged out of consideration. The intrinsic limit on what you can do with a human being is also gone, as we see in many places in the world, particularly China. If there's to be a limit, we'll have to make it. And who gets to do that? So how do you hack a human being? Let's begin with the software of the mind and consider two methods that characterize the 20th century: indoctrination and propaganda. They're crude, but they're still with us. But something's coming along that'll be much more effective. Aren't you glad? There's a striking similarity between old-fashioned software and ideologies. Neither learn. Instead, they merely categorize. When it comes to ideologies, something like communism, what can't be categorized is either lost or goes into a malware folder and gets labeled reactionary or homophobic or whatever the thing is that you're trying to condemn at the moment. What matters is the logic of the system. So long as an ideology is working according to its own rules, too bad for reality. Have you ever gotten into a conversation with a fully indoctrinated leftist, a true Marxist, and been frustrated by the fact that the practical examples that you provide to essentially point out the weaknesses in their outlook just don't seem to stick? They just kind of go right by them? Well, this is why. There's no category for what you're saying except malware, except reactionary thinking, except whatever. There's a folder where all that stuff goes. Because the system, in their minds, works. The ideology is internally consistent. Doesn't matter what the real world has to say. The real world must do as it is told. It does not teach us anything. This is the outlook. Now, we see this in many ways, not only in college environments, subjects like gender studies, even in places like nursery school, we see it today. But minds aren't software, and that's why reality must be pre-digested and regurgitated for the public, and this is where propaganda comes in. It reinforces the program or the ideology and filters out what people don't want us to be aware of through traditional media. But more subtly, we see this going on in the internet. What doesn't fit the program either goes unreported or ends up in that malware folder I mentioned a moment ago. It's a subtle art. Propaganda is a subtle art. It calls for a rare combination of rhetorical skill or aptitude and willful blindness. Every ideology works this way, by the way, whether we label them left or right. And what I want to talk about now is transhumanism, which is an ideology kind of new to the scene. And what we see with that is that instead of just hacking the just hacking the software, transhumanism endeavors to hack the wetware as well. Now, hacking our mental software is as old as totalitarianism. And in a certain respect, hacking our wetware, our physical bodies, isn't all that new either. It's the stuff of eugenics. The eugenics movement in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, was an attempt to level up humanity through selective breeding. You could call it transhumanism 1.0. And contrary to popular belief, the Nazis did not consider the Germanic peoples to be the master race. What they considered them to be is good breeding stock. If you want to see the documentation on this, Hannah Arendt provides it all. She wrote the book on totalitarianism that was published right after the Second World War, and she went through all the German files, and she's documented everything. They didn't really think the Germans were the master race. They were going to make the master race using the German people. That was the plan. So, transhumanism 2.0 is not content with the upper limit that carbon-based life places on the project. In other words, what we can achieve just through selective breeding. The Nazis, in other words, were not transcendent enough. Now the goal is to upgrade ourselves using silicon and other materials that are more durable and functional than the wetware we're born with. And while artificial intelligence is a separate project, it is indispensable to this one. Transhumanists want to physically link our brains to artificial intelligence so that we become practically godlike. So in that little story that I told at the beginning of my talk, it's all based actually on stuff that they're working on. Now, I obviously, in sort of a, I guess, sarcastic way, introduced idolatry, but I actually think that's really what's going on anyway. And what I did is I just tried to make it evident, more evident. But let's take a look at what the transhumanists are up to. It may seem far-fetched to link our brains to artificial intelligence, and it's probably not going to work. But that doesn't mean that billions of dollars aren't being poured into the project. Billions are. Projects like Neuralink, I don't know if you're familiar with Neuralink. It's one of the companies that Elon Musk has founded. And they're achieving some early success stories, or there are certain stories that are being told, and you can find them in the media about certain developments with Neuralink that are promising. By the way, you know, the people that they're working on with the Neuralink project are essentially paraplegics, people who can't use their arms or legs. And the hope is that through the Neuralink, literally a linkage directly between a person's brain and software, that these people will be able to acquire some degree of agency through technical means. And by the way, I'm not against that. That's a marvelous thing. There's a little boy in my church that was just born last year with no arms and legs, and my hope is that someday that we'll have prosthetics and an ability to link them to his brain that will make it really possible for him to function and get around and do productive work in our society. I think that'd be marvelous. But healing and enhancement are two different things. Healing's great. Therapy is great. Enhancement, well, what do you do with a person that just chops off his legs because he wants those? That's the world I think we're heading to. It's like the $6 million man without the benefit of an accident. It's just like, take off the legs. I like those other ones. They're faster, they're cooler, they jump higher, they're stronger. I want those legs. I think that's what we're going to get. Now, when it comes to transhumanism 2.0, what we've got today, Ray Kurzweil is perhaps the best known evangelist. How many folks are familiar with Ray Kurzweil? Wow. He's a name you really need to look up, folks. He's been working on this project for decades. There's a remarkable documentary that served as the basis for the film Transcendent Man. And it's entitled Transcendent Man, and it's about Ray Kurzweil. He's like Brian Johnson. You familiar with Brian Johnson, the guy that says, "Don't die"? So he's kind of like, I guess, the minor league version of Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil, by the way, was kind of a higher up in Google for like a decade or more. He's a remarkable person. I've got a friend who actually works for him directly, so I'm like 1 degree removed from Kurzweil, and I've thought about seeing if I can't get together with him. But anyway, he's remarkably creepy too, and I think you'll see that in a minute. Now, rather than summarize what he said and run the risk of misrepresenting him, I'm just going to quote him at length and let him speak for himself. I think you'll see he's clear and easy to follow and incredibly unnerving. These quotes are from his latest book, The Singularity is Nearer, which came out in 2024, When We Merge with AI. By the way, I reviewed that book for World Magazine. So where do we begin with Mr. Kurzweil? How about at the end, when he considers the question, who can I be? This is from a chapter on consciousness and identity entitled, Who Am I? Throughout, he periodically refers to himself in the third person, so just note that. Also take note that he uses the term singularity for the hoped-for advent of artificial intelligence upgrading itself indefinitely, something humans currently have to do for it. So let me just quickly define singularity. Singularity is a term that's used in physics to refer to kind of the event horizon where we can no longer see what becomes of information that when it's passed beyond the event horizon. An example would be black holes. Something goes in, but we don't know where it goes or where it comes out or what becomes of it. That's a singularity. What he's referring to is artificial intelligence, which today is narrow artificial intelligence. So what we are dealing with today is sort of the early kind of versions of artificial intelligence. And it's narrow because artificial intelligence acquires proficiency in a very narrow range of knowledge, but in that narrow range, its knowledge is far superior to what a human being is capable of. An example would be AlphaGo. You're familiar with AlphaGo? AlphaGo was an AI that was developed to play the game Go, which is an ancient game in the Orient, played in places like Korea and Japan and China and so forth. Much more complicated than chess. It was believed that artificial intelligence would never be able to beat human players, world-class players. And it did. It basically taught itself. This is the thing about artificial intelligence that people just don't get. It doesn't work like traditional software. It basically it has the capacity to learn. So there's no sort of code writer out there. In fact, AI is now writing more and more code. By the way, if you're someone who's a computer programmer, you're job is at risk. I'm not the guy who thinks that Eric Schmidt, former head of Google, says you're all out of work in about 2 years. Because AI has now mastered code writing and can write code quicker and better most of the time than most people. But this is narrow artificial intelligence. And an example is in that game, sort of this confrontation between AlphaGo and a human being, this world, #1 rated Go player. AlphaGo made a move that in the history of Go had never been made before. I'm talking like centuries, if not millennia, of playing. And it just caught this guy that the AlphaGo was playing against by surprise. He didn't know what to make of it. It seemed like it was maybe a fluke, maybe an error. Turned out 50 moves later, that was the move that made him resign. In other words, AlphaGo is thinking 50 steps ahead. How many people can do that? I have a hard time thinking 3 steps ahead. So let's just concede that when it comes to narrow artificial intelligence, we can't compete. But what's in view is AGI, artificial general intelligence, where artificial intelligence has facility or agency over multiple domains. This is the stuff of science fiction, and this is what they're working on. I'm talking in a big way. Everything from XAI to DeepMind, they're all working on this. The Chinese are working on it as well. And then, if that's achieved, then self-recurrence or self-recursive improvement can kick in, and the artificial intelligence can improve itself indefinitely. And if that occurs, then we have super artificial intelligence or artificial superintelligence, ASI. And that is when people say, we've lost. The world is no longer ours. So all that stuff that you thought was just science fiction, they're working on it. And they're making progress. I'm following this stuff every day. Now you might say, well, ChatGPT, it's cute. That's right, it's cute. That's not the only way artificial intelligence can be developed with large language models and so forth. And by the way, it's getting better and better, and there are all sorts of weird things that are coming out of it. But I'm getting to my talk for tomorrow. Let me finish up with Kurzweil, someone who really believes in it. So this is something that he said. Our questions, this is Kurzweil, our questions of identity are tightly interconnected with issues of consciousness, free will, and determinism. In light of these ideas, I could say that this particular person, Ray Kurzweil, he's speaking of himself in the third person, is both the result of incredibly precise conditions and the product of my own choices. As a self-modifying information pattern, I have certainly shaped myself through decisions throughout my life about whom to interact with, what to read, and where to go. Yet, despite my share of responsibility for who I am, my self-actualization is limited by many factors outside my control. My biological brain evolved from a very different kind of prehistoric life and predisposes me to habits that I would rather not have. And I cannot learn fast enough or remember well enough to know all the things I would like to know. I can't reprogram it to free me from fears, traumas, and doubts that I know are preventing me from achieving what I would like to achieve. And my brain sits in a body that is gradually aging, although I work hard to slow this process, and is biologically programmed to eventually destroy the information pattern that is Ray Kurzweil. The promise of the singularity is to free us from all those limitations. Imagine how much more we'll be able to shape ourselves when we can program our brains directly. So merging with superintelligent AI will be a worthy achievement, but it is a means to a higher end. Once our brains are backed up on a more advanced digital substrate, our self-modification powers can be fully realized. Our behaviors can align with our values, and our lives will not be marred and cut short by the failings of our biology. Finally, humans can be fully responsible for who we are. It would be difficult to find a better example of Nietzsche's famous Übermensch than, which was his self-divinizing Superman, than that. Did you notice, though, that Kurzweil described himself as a self-modifying information pattern? He isn't a spirit. In his own estimation, he's software. Well, the technical challenge of backing up our brains to a more advanced digital substrate may prove insurmountable. It's the upgrade that Kurzweil lives for. What makes artificial intelligence different, as I noted a minute ago, from old-fashioned software is its ability to learn. Kurzweil provides an easy-to-follow explanation for how that works, and that's one of the better parts of that book. What it learns from is data, lots and lots of data. But data isn't direct human experience of the world or participation in its underlying mysteries. It's merely information, the quantified simulacrum of human knowledge. This means AI thinks, if we may put it that way, like a machine, not like a human being. Now, technophiles, techno-utopians, that's another term I like to use, tend to be naively optimistic when it comes to technological breakthroughs. It's like a drug. What's newly possible dulls their thinking about what remains impossible. Or the unintended consequences. All these people tend to be autistic. They tend to have like only half a brain. They don't ever have any sense of the human costs when it comes to this kind of stuff. And when it comes to physically linking people to artificial intelligence, do transhumanists really believe the power will only flow in one direction? Will it only amplify our powers? Or will it subject us to someone else or something else? And even make us dumber in certain ways. By the way, MIT released a study not too long ago that does demonstrate the more you use artificial intelligence, the dumber you get. It's called offloading, sort of the intellectual offloading that occurs as you rely on artificial intelligence to do more and more things for you. You can't do things for yourself. It's like being in outer space. You know, when you're going around the Earth and there's no gravity, it's marvelous. You're up there floating around, able to do all kinds of things. Then when you come back to Earth, you realize, I can't walk anymore. It's because your muscles and your bones have atrophied from lack of stress, lack of use. Intelligence is only won through exercising intelligence. You cannot offload the work of thinking to a machine and stay smart. This is just such common sense. These people don't have that, though. I guess it's not that common. But now, another thing that Kurzweil is blind to are the implications of the adoption curve. Are you an early adopter, mid-adopter, late adopter, reluctant adopter, never adopter? I have a friend who was kind of the real estate king of Central Connecticut. He was my mentor in real estate for years. He drove a 1973 Rolls Royce, a Shadow, Phantom Shadow. Cool car. It was always in the shop, though. And he had like one 8-track tape because it had an 8-track tape player. And he still played that one 8-track tape all the time in the car. It was Johnny Cash, so it was okay. But anyways, that was him. He never had a cell phone. He just relied on his office assistant to do all of his communication for him. Today, Don has a smartphone. Even Don came around. And that's the way it is with this kind of stuff. But the early adopters generally are ahead. And when it comes to transhumanism, they'll be very far ahead if things work out the way they think. Now, at least Nietzsche was a realist in this regard. His Übermensch was not every man. Not only did he see Superman on the horizon, he believed that most people would be left behind. He called those people the last men, the dullards who preferred safety and pleasant sedation to the hazards of manfully overcoming limits. And speaking candidly, and Harari does this frequently, and that's why he's good to listen to, but also very disturbing. Yuval Noah Harari believes that most people in about 40 years will be literally useless. There will be no use for them in our society. So AI has set the stage for the obsolescence of man. Through a combination of AI and advanced robotics, people will find themselves redundant, being too slow, too stupid, and too expensive. And we're told that massive changes are coming in. We either should adapt or find ourselves unemployed and on universal basic income, UBI. This is where transhumanism acquires its eschatological edge. Harari, Kurzweil, Johnson, and others are prophets of a new age. And there are people who religiously believe these prophecies. And in that new future, either you will submit to the machine or you will face the doom of the Neanderthals. But is it inevitable? Is there a way to resist? Is there even a way to use artificial intelligence so that it serves humanity? That's what I'd like to talk about tomorrow. Anyway, that's enough for now. So how are we doing on time? Are we all done? I'm happy to answer questions if people have them. Or are we all ready to go out and get something to eat? Or what's next? Anybody in charge? Yeah.
You mentioned that the best way to increase intelligence is to exercise intelligence.
Right.
So apart from the one extreme of read a book and the other extreme of go get a doctorate degree, how can normal lay people in the church foster their intelligence?
Yeah, well, I think it's by actually working at thinking. And oftentimes, I think many of the things that we consider hobbies or a vocation in kind of nature are actually really helpful. There's a marvelous book that came out not too long ago called Range. Are you familiar with that book? Has anyone heard of the book Range? Basically, he contrasts two approaches, specialization versus generalization. A generalist is a person who, the old joke is, jack of all trades, master of none. Generally speaking, though, when we study the outcomes when it comes to people, unless you're Mozart, range is where you want to be. You want to have a much broader range. Now, if you're a Mozart, if you're like a real savant, if you're like a world-class, person in a particular field, like anything from being, like Tiger Woods at golf to, I don't know, obviously Mozart, then, focus. Great, focus. You become the world's best at that thing. But for most of us, we ought to think about how do we create a range of things that we are learning and working at in our lives. And that's, I think, something that can be a lot of fun, and it kind of gets you out of your, your comfort space and so forth, and helps you to grow intellectually. Yeah. Yeah, I think that Brad Littlejohn had a really good piece that came out today, and he addresses this matter. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Brad, but basically he thinks that we should age gate artificial intelligence in children, and I agree. Just like when we age gate like alcohol or a lot of other things. So we say, okay, this is really potent stuff. And you're not ready for it, and we need to get you ready for it. So I don't believe that we're going to be able to avoid artificial intelligence. It is the future. It's a tsunami. It's going to change everything. What I'm interested in is how does it... So, like when you read the stuff on artificial intelligence, this is kind of the interesting take I've had on this. Generally, your IT guys at your local company are clueless about it. It's really wild. I'll ask, a lot of people that I've interacted with, and I'll say, do you know who Geoffrey Hinton is? And they'll say, no. I said, what do you do for a living? Oh, you code. You don't know who Geoffrey Hinton is. He just won the Nobel Prize for inventing the neural network systems that make artificial intelligence possible, and you don't even know who he is. That's the way it is. There are a lot of people out there, and the higher you go in the world of artificial, the more freaked out people are. So, it's the people who are playing little games with ChatGPT. Oh, there's nothing to this. We don't need to worry. Well, no, there's a lot more to it. So, by the way, he quit Google. He was their lead guy, and he's preparing for the end. He's like building a kind of a digital, I guess, bunker. Anyway, encouraging thoughts. But so a lot of these guys are like saying, how do we contain it? So a guy named Mustafa Suleyman, he's one of the guys who helped found DeepMind. That's the company that came up with AlphaGo. But they also came up with something called AlphaFold. This gives you an example of why artificial intelligence could be really great and how it can be really great. AlphaFold identified all the different ways proteins can fold. Now, proteins are essential to life. Okay? Proteins are essential to life. AlphaFold identified 200 million ways proteins can fold. You know how long it would have taken human beings to do that? Like maybe 200 million years? In other words, it's really difficult stuff. If you ever see like schematics that illustrate the ways proteins fold, it's like, wow, it's just crazy. But, the therapies, the drugs, the different things that can come out of these, the work of AI, who knows? Maybe it will mean, helping the blind to see and the lame to walk again. So there's great things that we can do with artificial intelligence. So the kind of the gurus are all thinking about how do we contain it so that it doesn't take over the world. And Mustafa Suleyman, he wrote a book called The Next Wave, really interesting book, you should read it. He says you can't. There's just no way we're going to be able to contain this thing. It's just that powerful. But I'm not concerned about saving the world. I'm just concerned about saving me. So my little project is how do I make sure artificial intelligence doesn't take over my life? And that's where I'm focused my energies. And I'm working on a book that about that. That's how I got into it. Yeah.
So what are you going to do for your granddaughters to help them through that?
Well, yeah, we talk about that. So I built a bunker. Yeah, but I do think that there needs to be age gating. I do think that there needs to be ways that so in in fact, tomorrow, if you're here, I'll talk about the last chapter of the book where I talk about things that I think could be ways to be ready for this as families. So I'm focused mostly on families. So I do have some thoughts on it.
All right, everybody, let's give Chris a round of applause. Thank you for helping to prepare us.